Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on the 13 days of Halloween countdown, I just wanted to let you guys know, today is a very solemn day for me. My father-in-law passed away a couple of weeks ago, and today, being the start of the 13-day countdown, is also the day of his funeral. So, I'd like to dedicate this year's 13-day countdown to him, Tony Davis. And since baseball was such a big part of his life, you'll notice a link that is in the description down below that'll bring you over to pitch in for baseball and softball. Helps kids around the world play ball, and I feel like any donations you guys would be able to give would be wonderful in his memory. And now, on to tonight's story. Jeffrey hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for the small Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since it was founded back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for a pumpkin. Jeffrey was pretty sure that it had come out of their taxes, along with road work and the police force. Jeffrey had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffrey had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting in trouble several times for pushing them off the front porch. It never stopped the new one from appearing where the old one had been, but they always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffrey was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if we pulled a prank on Halloween? Like, a big prank. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Kevin leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffrey. What kind of prank? Asked Chris, the cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Jeffrey was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, and black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely believed himself to be some kind of badass, and Jeffrey had seen him make good on many of the less-than-ideal threats Chris often made. Chris was also the most stable of Jeffrey's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. Something big. Something that will never be forgotten, Jeffrey said, grinning hugely. Jeffrey was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffrey wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out shirt, gold chain, wind pants, a lot of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffrey's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in on this in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a piercing eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins? If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns, I'm not talking about the ones at people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the shops, and the display on the commons, too. The two of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffrey obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctively evil grin as he thought over the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffrey knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart. We'll be legends, more than legends, we'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffrey laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffrey had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffrey's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like that would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffrey was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode their bikes towards Jeffrey's house, they had passed through downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through with their fair one year showed resplendently on the front of the town hall. The display tables of pumpkins outside the jack-o'-lantern museum made the tables sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought again about how vital the stupid things were to the town. They could get in real trouble for this. So the first order of business would be masks. They need to be full face masks, too, Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. I don't want them to see our hair or our noses and identify us somehow. Kevin laughed. Easy, my bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash for masks, I'll bring back some quality stuff. Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said that full face masks would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look because he got a little flustered. Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not? Chris shrugged at Jeffrey at her side as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 with each grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling a 20 out of his pocket and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure that they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back before any of the booze-soaked brains at the party had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams. Dreams that he would stagger awake from and then fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased by what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat to salute to the mysterious figure, then it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured they could cut around on their bikes with less notice than a car, and they'd be faster than moving on foot. Jeffrey figured that they would have about an hour and a half to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in his shed they planned to use, and the three began to map their route. As long as Kevin got their masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. "Don't forget," Jeffrey reminded him. "I've got this, guys," Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled off for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then. hoping against hope that they would have the last piece of their puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, "Still haven't heard from Kevin." Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin better not have messed this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight. And Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday after school. Not a text, not a call, nothing. He forgot. He forgot, and you know it, Chris said. We don't know that yet, Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. Won't return my texts. His phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spend the night in Seaver, we could be screwed. Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all. And as Chris walked toward him, he spread his arms as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs when Chris socked him in the gut instead. Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffrey pulled him back up, but Kevin took it in stride as Jeffrey tried to pull the greaser away from him. "What was that for?" Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. "That's for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me." Chris balled up his fist, straining against Jeffrey as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffrey pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle him. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffrey said, still not holding out hope for the scratch-brained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. Think you're gonna find them very fitting, too." Jeffrey took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain gray grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffrey could see a big plastic roach crawling from its nostril as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffrey couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It'd be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled at the ghoulish thing as he grinned like a fool. Jeffrey could feel a lot of anxiety melt away, and when he raised his hand this time, it was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect. Act like I'd bring back anything less," Kevin said with no small amount of swagger. Jeffrey pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic sit on his face like a second skin. "Tonight, we're gonna make history." As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and masks stored in their backpacks, along with the required 6-packs of beer to get into the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party around 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back or front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar, 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The three stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches, their nerves turned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to be noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45, they'd slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 1st through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th, and Jeffrey would take 11th through 15th. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If everyone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing and then meet back up when they lost the cops. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think that they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other two could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know that it was 9:45, the three of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffrey slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath as he pulled his bat from his pack. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath his mask, smashing the other two and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffrey had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites came to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffrey reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout the year and feel deep shame. But tonight, it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffrey was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore, oh no. Jeffrey had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses they sat as silent guardians over. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffrey felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffrey as the boy grabbed for another pumpkin, Jeffrey was terrified for a half-second. The mask had become turned during his efforts, and he hadn't seen the man as he came sneaking towards him. The light was poor, but Jeffrey was pretty sure it was Mr. Basque, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffrey what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffrey had a short and squashy tug of war with Mr. Basque, and finally just had the bright idea to let go of the hateful gourd. Jeffrey's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The older man stumbled backward as Jeffrey released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin spattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffrey for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited its wrath on his house. And for a moment, Jeffrey came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up. But then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the streetlight seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable with the axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered into death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffrey was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. When it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. To hell with him. Your work must be fulfilled. Jeffrey nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffrey finished his work, it was nearly midnight. How had it taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffrey had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffrey's clothes were spattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary. Jeffrey felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkins squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cool breeze drive him forward, the chill stoking his blaze of revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffrey its power. As Jeffrey rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on his way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffrey had been in his right mind, it would have doubtlessly seemed like a little much. They hadn't agreed on this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at the same moment, Jeffrey was emboldened by the sight of so much destruction. This was his will, so Jeffrey thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffrey felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure from the sidewalk. Jeffrey expected him to appear in the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffrey for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief. But if he were there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffrey found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffrey gawked at it, speechless, at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffrey forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him onto the street. They fell on him as they wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have any strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffrey to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffrey was shoved towards the strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffrey saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the thick fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffrey was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person he wanted, though, because Jeffrey saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked on his shoulder. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure when he came riding out of the fog. Jeffrey saw him, though. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffrey saw the other two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof, stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next. His armor forest green. His horned helm the color of moss. His sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffrey could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice, and when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffrey heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down at the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of the vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightsticks and the man's ballistic vest, and finally, through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other two cops looked at those twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffrey jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The rider slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffrey knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town. Chris and Kevin followed mutely behind him. Jeffrey pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to let him out. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spidery cracks. But the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left them there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffrey kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffrey was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over the town, and 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes. Broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids that had escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and two guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffrey just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of the the pumpkins he shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffrey must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how everything seemed to go to hell the second I decided to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up only the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Well, sure you do. There's a mural in the museum. You've probably seen it 1,000 times and never really thought much of it. The settlers that found this place came fleeing something they prayed they'd left in the old country. That image on the mural with a tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders, as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him that it was stories of the Green Man, spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due." Jeffrey said nothing. "That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition's still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon that once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You left us naked in the breeze, boy. You burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight." The sheriff's eyes bore into him, but Jeffrey said nothing. "Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil?" He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffrey refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff left. Jeffrey never saw him again. Jeffrey never saw much of anyone again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffrey smiled. He knew they'd come back for him. When the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffrey had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffrey had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too once he slipped it on. Jeffrey crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. These two imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffrey slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him that he had work to do. The Green Man called Jeffrey to action. And who was he to deny him? Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. If you scroll down to the description at the very bottom, you'll find a whole bunch of people there. Also, we've included this nice little scrolling thing because the number of people who support me on Patreon has gotten so big that I'm afraid it might actually max out the description. So we've included this here as the little scrolling text on the end screens. So everybody on that scrolling text, everybody I'm about to mention right now and mispronounce all of your names, and everybody who can donate even $1, thank you so much. A very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Reaper61167, Bobby Karman, Tristain, Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Thiccy McQuicky, SamaHigh, CrusaderChocobo, SpookyShel, Atomaurus, Grand Moth the Milky, Big Smoke 369, Captain Scurvy, SaltyIrishPoet, Estebean, Brayden Morris, Nate Kuhl, HorrorFan1212, Hour Minute Second Time, Kyle Reznak, David Martin, Scare-ington the Unkempt, Robert Malcolm, Angelus, Spanky, Snoochie Boochie, Seclude, Lupita Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Tyler Fletcher, Merxenum, Red Shadow Cat, Xavier the Cheyenne, Demix, Sean Cadieu-baker, 6 Gay Rats in a Trenchcoat, Turtleman, Rob Like Sharp Things, Cryolinian, Xavier Graphius, Lord Life's Best, Goring Tramagasi, Maria Walker, Emily Mitchell, Crazy Kid, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Eka Limchok, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Coffee Zombie, Hidden Tiger, Shelly J, Jeremy H, Psychomel, Nana, Deleted Account, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Titanic Aries, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Sashi Suzaku, Cronut 509, Kaylee Ambrose, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades' Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Benjamin Welveritt, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. As always, thank you guys so much. because you guys help me do everything that I do here. You guys help pay authors for stories and commission stories and do everything that I can do to make this channel and make this podcast the best it could possibly be. So thank you all for supporting me here. And as always, everyone, sweet dreams.